Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will ask attendees to stay muted for the duration of the program, but comments and questions are welcome at any time in the chat, and they will be forwarded on to the moderator during the Q&A as well. And I will now ask my colleague, Dr. Shannon Eves, to open our program.
Thank you, Elisa. In the wake, well, first off, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here for our inaugural Black History Month lecture. In the wake of the death of George Floyd and the rise of public consciousness around Black death and state violence, many entities, including those at the College of Charleston, felt compelled to issue statements of support and to profess that Black lives matter. When the Department of History considered the prospects of issuing its own statement, there was a lot of uneasiness. Many of us had made statements and mourned after Walter Scott was shot in the back by a North Charleston police officer. And when 9 members of Mother Emanuel AME Church, just 2 blocks from the College of Charleston, were murdered after welcoming a stranger to worship and pray amongst them. Despite our statements, here we had yet another Black person needlessly killed in the street. The consensus was that we did not want to make one more statement unless it was followed up with a plan of action to acknowledge our department's own failures to address systemic racism and to enact measurable solutions to increase diversity and inclusion amongst our faculty, in our curriculum, and inside the classroom. This inaugural Black History Month lecture is just one manifestation of our department's commitment to do this work. I am truly proud of the work we have done thus far and look forward to continuing the hard work ahead. At this time, I want to introduce the president of the College of Charleston, President Andrew Shue.
Thank you, Professor Eves. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's lecture presented by our History Department as part of its annual Black History Month programming. Professor Douglas Flowe will be talking about a fascinating topic from the past. However, it is one that is still very much relevant in understanding our present. The ubiquity of Jim Crow throughout the United States during the 20th century has proven to have far-reaching negative impacts, not only on the men and families affected firsthand by this oppression, but on most every American town and city. By truly understanding our past, we may hope to address our present and improve our future. And today's lecture is a way we do that. Before I turn things back to Professor Eves, I want to share a not so obvious connection of Professor Flowe to the College of Charleston. In looking over his CV earlier, I noticed that Professor Flowe was awarded the Louis D. Rubin Article Prize for a piece he published in 2016 about folklore, urban insurrection, and the killing of the Black hero. For those of you not familiar with the name Louis Rubin, he is a member of the North Carolina Literary Hall of Fame for his lifetime achievements of being an editor, novelist, essayist, teacher, and publisher. Rubin grew up here in Charleston and even attended the College of Charleston in the early 1940s. before he headed off, of course, to serve in the US Army in World War II. He even wrote a novel about the College of Charleston during the late 1930s and early 1940s. Later in life, he received an honorary doctorate from the College of Charleston. In fact, that was the honorary degree was given to him in 1989. So it is especially appropriate and poignant that the College of Charleston welcomes a Reuben Award recipient to address us here today. Thank you, Professor Flowe, for being here with us. With that, let me turn it back to Professor Eves. You're still muted.
Thank you, President Hsu, so much for joining us tonight. Your presence is greatly appreciated as we launch this new initiative. At this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Elisa Jones.
Thank you, Shannon. I am very happy to welcome Dr. Douglas Flowe this evening. Dr. Flowe is an assistant professor of history at Washington University in St. Louis, where he teaches courses on urban history, criminality, masculinity, and other subjects relating to race, crime, and gender. He received his Ph.D. at the University of Rochester and recently published his first book, which we will hear about this evening, Uncontrollable Blackness, African American Men and Criminality in Jim Crow, New York, with UNC Press. His work has appeared in publications such as the Journal of Urban History and the Journal of African American History, and he is currently working on a second book that will trace the experiences of Black inmates in the mid-20th century carceral state. As a reminder, we will be taking questions and comments in the chat throughout the program, and we will address those in the Q&A at the end. So please feel free to add those as Dr. Flowe is sharing his research with us. And now I would like to just thank you, Dr. Flowe, for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to first thank the entire community of the College of Charleston for your interest in my work and for the invitation, and also the history department. Also, more specifically, Elisa Jones and Shannon Eves for setting this up, and President Hsu for that really wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to know of that connection, which I did not know until you mentioned it just now. So thank you so much for that. I want to share my screen because I have a few slides that I'd like you all to be able to see while I'm talking. Is that good? All right, great. It's obviously a great honor to be here. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk with all of you about my work. As you can see, I'll be talking about my book, Uncontrollable Blackness, African American Men and Criminality in New York, in Jim Crow, New York, which was released just last year. I thought a really good place to begin would be by looking at the cover. The man on the cover is Sonny Wilkes. That's not his actual name, that's a pseudonym that I had to use in order to protect his family. The archives I use asked me to make a pseudonym for all of the people in the prison documents that I look at. So I call him Sonny Wilkes. He emigrated from the Honduras to New York City in 1899, where he worked as a waiter, he worked as a porter, a longshoreman working along the shore, very difficult work, and a number of other occupations. And he's married in 1907 to a woman that he met here in America, met in New York. And by the time of this photo, which is taken in 1915, he had an 8-year-old daughter with his wife, and they were both living in Brooklyn. But during that summer, he and his wife separated, and he's living in central Manhattan in a very large community that's mixed between African Americans and a number of white ethnic immigrants. But this is really kind of the largest central pre-Harlem African American community. He's living there with another woman named Ada Wright. In July of that year, Ada Wright's former boyfriend confronted him on the street on West 61st Street, and things became violent. And that's what led to him being booked and having this particular picture taken. Wilkes later described what happened on the corner of 61st Street by telling police that, quote, and I've redacted the name here again to protect their names from the archive. He says, "The assailant tried to shoot me about a girl, and I saved myself by shooting him first." This is what he tells the police when he's sent to prison eventually. He was idle at the time, and he explained that he had lost his job and was trying to figure out a way to make enough money to support his wife and his child, even though he didn't live with them. So he found himself in a situation that many African-American men at the time found themselves in, where job, housing, spatial discrimination, et cetera, had limited their opportunities, where they often could not keep up with the demands of life in the city and life supporting their families because of the unique ways that they were discriminated against in the city. And he was also finding himself in the common circumstances that Black men very often found themselves in, where they might experience violence and arrest on the street. So I chose this photo for the cover of the book the moment I saw it in the archives. As soon as I saw this photo, I remember sitting there looking at it and thinking, this is what I want on the cover. And this was back in 2017. And I chose it because in the photo, you can see this mixture of shock, anger, possibly fear, and also possibly the resolve to survive that Sonny Wilkes may have experienced in that moment, in the moment of his arrest and booking. After 15 years of working and surviving the crucible of American Jim Crow in New York City after emigrating, and mostly staying out of trouble. He was arrested a couple of times for disorderly conduct, which was a charge that African Americans very often faced even when they were not doing anything illegal, but just occupying urban space in the ways that working class people very often did in New York City. So it's clear that he really did, he was following the law and he was doing well for 15 years. And he was finally in this moment ensnared by this system that in many ways was designed to ensnare him eventually. And you can see that, I imagine that you can see the certainty on his face that he would not see the streets or his family in the context of freedom for quite some time, and that he's most likely contemplating these things. I also thought the photo was interesting because his bow tie is crooked, likely because he was jostled by police when they dragged him away from the scene of the shooting. And in the photo, he's sitting in this claustrophobic, smoky police house deep within the notorious Tenderloin district that I mentioned before that was had a large African-American community, and that's where he was arrested. And he's in this precinct not far from West 61st Street that was well known for the chorus of cries to be heard from its windows as police very often abused arrestees and sometimes tortured them into confessions, a process that was that some people called the third degree or an indoor lynching. And so in this moment, Sonny Wilkes is motionless for the instant of the photo, trying to follow the directions of the police surrounding him and attempting to comprehend the profundity of his situation. And I think it's interesting to just at this moment think about the fact that he had no way of knowing that in that moment, he was not only looking at a camera controlled by a white officer in a dingy, musty room in a police station, but he was also staring more than 100 years into the future on the cover of a book that he would never get to read, but that he would unfortunately live every moment of. He eventually convinced the judge that he was in fact defending himself when he shot the man on the street during the conflict that ended in that death. But he still received an indeterminate sentence of up to 16 years in prison for first-degree murder and went to New York State's very famous Auburn prison. So I tell this story because Sonny Wilkes, his story, and those of countless other men like him provide this opportunity to dissect the meaning of illegal or criminalized behavior by Black men. it allows me as the writer of a book like Uncontrollable Blackness to seize the opportunity but it's not meant in any way to condemn them, nor is it meant to romanticize them. It is really, as a historian, I'm more primarily concerned with understanding the confluence of circumstances that placed Wilkes on that corner on 61st Street in the first place, on that day that changed his life. How did he find himself in that situation? Again, without any judgment, but just kind of understanding what happened. I'm also concerned with the conditions that made the man he killed approach him in the way that he did. What was happening around that man that brought him to those circumstances at that moment? And then also those that made it so that Wilkes was armed with a gun and he was ready to use it in that particular moment. Ultimately, I'm interested in the society that they lived in, the ways that that society had a part in their decision-making processes, and how that society created and crafted these customized crucibles for them, and then how they navigated that crucible. And then lastly, it's really important for me to understand what these sorts of actions meant to them. There's been a lot of historical work on, kind of understanding systems of oppression throughout American history, but there has been no work in historical context that is meant to understand the specific crucible that African-American men face and then how they thought about illegal behaviors. So I think one of the greatest powers of the historian should be the ability to objectively observe and understand the past and derive meaning that can contextualize the present. And that was what I was doing in the book. It's kind of like attempting to comprehend the leaves of a tree by studying its root and its seeds and the ground that it's planted in. So while judgment and bias can color the perspectives of all, or anytime anyone presents their perspective, there will be judgment and bias in there to some extent. But I think historical study is uniquely positioned to provide a clear scope of an unseen past, and then ultimately to hold up a looking glass that reflects ourselves. And that's what I'm looking to do with this book and also with the work that I'm doing in the future. I also want to just contextualize Sonny Wilkes a little bit further and say we can all understand him because he's human, and the choices he made were set in a context that might force unwelcome decisions for anyone who is navigating a crucible of an entire society that threatens their livelihood, that threatens their freedom, and that threatens their ability to self-determine at every step. And if he was telling the truth about defending himself, which all the evidence points towards, yes, that he was, then he never actually broke the law. But he lived the next 6 years of his life as prisoner number 34772, simply for trying to survive on the streets of his neighborhood. He's eventually released for good behavior in the fall of 1921, but not before his wife passes away and he loses most of his connection with his own child, who is ultimately being raised by one of his aunts somewhere in New York City. And I think also ultimately Wilkes's trial represents how the city itself becomes an antagonist for African-American men who migrate there looking for a better set of circumstances to self-determine their own life. And that's part of the way that I wrote the book, is to think about these many different spaces in the city that end up becoming obstacles where there should be opportunities for them to advance. Whether it's by choice or by happenstance, they find themselves sometimes and very often compelled into violent situations, saddled with economic circumstances that made it so that illegality is actually particularly alluring, and then also entangled with the criminal justice system in ways that really ravages their lives and doubles down on some of the loss of opportunity. But in the process, some of them also used criminality purposely in order to gain some sort of distinct advantages. And so this book is meant to tell their stories finally from their perspectives. There's a quote in the epigraph of the introduction that I thought in many ways encapsulated the underlying theory that the book brings forth in very simple terms. And it's a quote taken from Malidoma Patrice Saumé's book, Of Water and the Spirit, where he says, "There are times when disobedience heals a very ailing part of the self. It relieves the human spirit's distress at being forced into narrow boundaries. For the nearly powerless, defying authority is often the only power available." So what does this mean? The way that I interpret that and the way that I apply it in my thoughts about my own work is that he's saying disobedience can be understood as finding one's way around a seemingly immutable power structure when that power structure is definitively bent against you. That under certain circumstances, what one might call criminality, and I really complicate ideas of what criminality is in the book and bring those questions forward, that what one might think of as criminality can be for someone else the only source of resistance. And I want to be very clear, again, this is not to romanticize crime, nor is it to excuse behaviors that might be harmful to individuals or to society, but it's to understand the source of actions that might be meant to dismantle unequal power structures, whether those actions are done with that motive in mind consciously or not. It's also to recognize that in some cases, legal behaviors may be criminalized when those behaviors challenge the status quo. Most assuredly, there are instances where the sources of resistance employed by disenfranchised groups might in fact be criminalized subsequently, specifically to prevent those actions from disrupting well-established power relations. And it is in these cases when my book argues that legitimate mainstream pathways to normative success, to normative self-actualization are blocked. In those cases, one might feel forced to reconsider their relationship with the law or with the established order. So just to be very clear, these are some of the foundational questions that I'm asking in the book and that I will continue to ask as my scholarship evolves into my second project. One of them is, what was the reality of criminality among African-American men, right? We all know that there were many race-based cultural, political, and popular cultural, social forces in the early 20th century that reinforced the idea that African-Americans were inherently criminal. And hopefully we all know that that's not true, that it wasn't true then and that it's not now. Although there are some conservative criminological theories that in some cases don't seem to have dissected this very well, if at all. But my book is meant to assess the ways that African-American men were criminalized, right? So maybe forced into illegal territory, and how and why some people deliberately committed crimes. So I'm looking at the reality. What was the imagined reality and what was the actual reality of some people who did commit crimes? The second question is, how did they conceptualize the reasons and causes of their behaviors that fell outside of the law? Again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but what were the ways that some of these men believed they were either resisting or believed that there was some logic behind what they did? What were their reasons? This is a tricky thing to get at, and I'll talk a little bit maybe in the question and answer period about the sources I used, but that was one of the main goals I came into the book with. And then also in some cases, I'm looking at how they might have deployed the stigma of criminality or dangerousness in order to protect themselves or in order to gain some measure of control or power over space or resources, etc. Once again, knowingly or not. And then what ways could crime become a site of extraction of resources? For people who are boxed out of the normative mainstream economy and the normative mainstream ways of securing resources, how does criminality, how does extra legal activity become this site of extraction? And then lastly, popular concepts of manhood at the time were very often defined by access to public space, sustainable work, the ability to support and protect one's family, possibly to control one's family in some patriarchal ways, the ability to secure oneself by physical force and a variety of types of consumption and leisure. And so in each chapter, I explore the linkages that the men that I'm writing about made in their own words between their behaviors, whether illegal or criminalized, and their own emerging sense of masculinity. So how did they connect manhood to illegal behavior? And so I'm going to look at one particular chapter in order to illustrate the way that I'm thinking these things through. The chapter I'll use as an example is the second chapter in the book, which is entitled Sex, Blood, Guns, and Gambling, Pleasure, Profit, and Peril in New York City's Black Saloons. The chapter is divided into 3 sections. The first section is called Pleasure, which looks at the ways in which African-American men use saloons as a site of pleasurable consumption. Profit is the section that looks at Black saloon keepers and how they were looking to make a profit and the things that threatened their profitability, which is what I'll be looking at in this talk today. And then the final part, which is called Peril, looks at the dangers that were associated with those spaces and how sometimes they led to different types of intra-racial or horizontal violence. The book is generally looking at the period from the late 1800s, 1890 or so, to the Great Depression. But this chapter focuses on the period from 1900 to 1925 or so, mostly because I'm looking to avoid talking about the Prohibition era when Prohibition era and after, when a lot of the saloons and leisure spaces were taken over by white people that did not live in the community. So you have, as a good example, the Cotton Club in Harlem, which was in a lot of ways meant to kind of exploit its proximity to Black communities, but it didn't, it was owned by, I don't remember the name of the person who owned it, but it had a white owner. And in a lot of ways, African-Americans were barred from using that space. So I'm looking at the period before we really see this transformation of leisure in African-American communities, when African-Americans had more control over it, and where they had a lot more to say about the direction. What we see in this period is that civil rights legislation made it seem that race relations were going into a positive direction. There were laws like the Malby Act of 1895, which integrated all commercial spaces in New York State. However, what we see in reality is that white New Yorkers very often pushed against the inclination to integrate housing and to integrate leisure spaces in a number of ways, including physical housing segregation, job discrimination. We also see these spikes of police brutality and these large-scale racial riot attacks on African-American communities, but also just simply the reinforcement of old and new racial boundaries. And so that's the context within which all of this is taking place. I thought I would start this section by looking at this photo. This is a photo taken by photojournalist Jacob Riis in the 1890s for his book looking at working class New Yorkers, How the Other Half Lives. And it's clearly a staged photo, but it shows a parable of the racial tensions people experience in close quarters in New York. What's important about this is I want to pause for a second and just say, this is in that community that I mentioned, the Tenderloin. The Tenderloin is this large section of central Manhattan, south of the Park, north of Wall Street. And it's really an area that we might, now have broken down into many different communities, but it was just a large area where, Midtown and San Juan Hill and Greenwich Village are kind of included in this big amorphous community. It was very mixed. You have African-Americans living side by side with white immigrants, with Germans and Italians, et cetera. And what's interesting is that even though they're living side by side and living on the same blocks, very rarely, I've looked at a lot of census tracts for this area, very rarely do I see separate families that are Black and white living in the same building. Very often they're living side by side, but not in the same building unless there's an interracial couple, which did happen once in a while. But so this means that they're living in very close proximity. And Jacob Riis was a part of a movement against interracial saloons. This photo was a setup. It was meant to, as I said before, to parody or to kind of make a statement about what's happening in these saloons and the possible danger. It's meant to dramatize racial closeness. Jacob Riis is not alone. There were many anti-crime and anti-vice organizations in the city that investigated spaces like this in order to find illegal activity, but also to be critical of interracial closeness. In this photo, you see an African-American man sitting on a barrel. Outside of the bottom of the image where you can't see right here, it says, I think it says rum or whiskey on the barrel, which really kind of makes it clear that this is a typical saloon space in New York City. He's sitting and seemingly really relaxing and enjoying himself, possibly oblivious to the fact that he is making this lady, who happens to be a white lady, at his feet uncomfortable. She's looking, once again, to dramatize that sense of discomfort. She has this facial expression that that kind of expresses maybe disgust. And then also we can see right next to her that there's someone's hand surrounding her, looking to possibly pull her away, possibly protect her. And I would imagine, although it's kind of hard with the graininess of the photo, that is the hand of a white man. And then over here to the left, you can see that there is, it's kind of hard to notice, there's an African-American woman, and I cannot explain why she's facing the wall and seems to be holding up a piece of paper, but there's something here that was purposely set up people didn't have camera phones like we do now. So this wasn't a candid moment. It was set up purposely to convey something about interracial closeness in saloons, something that was very popular to convey from progressive organizations like the one that Riis was a part of. Most prominently, there is an organization called the Committee of 14. The Committee of 14 was an organization that originally was looking to investigate saloons that were selling alcohol illegally. This is kind of like the beginnings of, or at least the beginnings of the 20th century movement towards alcohol prohibition, which ends up culminating later on in the Volstead Act. But while they're just looking at these saloons and looking for liquor violations, they start to see a lot of interracial contact. So they start fanning out investigators across the city. Many of those investigators, if not all of them, were posing as customers in places of concern. They would go in and they would have a drink and they would meet people that they considered to be, that they thought were possibly engaged in prostitution, very often stopping just short of committing crimes themselves and sometimes actually committing those crimes. But they're also reporting in detail on forums like this, everything that they see in these establishments. Sometimes they're pages long of these really lurid descriptions. So in this form, you can see the name of the place that they're investigating, the date and the time, and who the brewer is, which is an important detail, who is supplying this place with alcohol. And then further down, you can see a long description of the saloon and some information about what they witnessed when they were in this place. But I want to draw your attention to an inset here. We can see that there is a kind of reckoning of how many Black and how many white people are in the saloon, and how many of those people are of which gender, and how many of them are in couples. Right? And that's very often what they would spend a lot of time explaining in the description, what's going on between these groups, these different races, between men and women. And the reports very often reflected the fact that the committee was emphasizing investigation of those places with interracial contact. And they worked the hardest to close those spaces. When they didn't find interracial contact, very often they would ignore other violations in those saloons and put their attention on places where there was interracial contact. Many of the reports, there is information about how these groups intermingled, interracial aspects, very often very sexualized, how many Black men are sitting at the table with white women, are they dancing, are they speaking, are they changing tables together, what's going on? When they found these sorts of things happening in these saloons, the committee would first make efforts to instruct these places on how to regain their trust. you can regain our trust if you separate white and Black people into separate parts of the saloon, or if you just completely bar one particular race and allow only the other race in. And there were a number of other things, move your pool table to the back of the building, or close the rooms in the back and don't let people go in there. And if these improvements weren't made, and they found out that those improvements weren't made in subsequent investigations, they would put pressure on police to raid the place, or they would put pressure on the brewers to pull their product and to destroy the business. So there's a number of implications here, and beyond the obvious, the kind of well understood human rights violations of this sort of segregation or any sort of segregation. This is important because of what I mentioned before about what the nature of this community was like. New York City's pre-Black Harlem residents lived in small pockets of central Manhattan in communities, as I mentioned before, heavily mixed with white ethnic immigrants. They lived on the same blocks, they lived in very crowded circumstances, they competed for housing, they competed for leisure spaces, et cetera. And as a result, if you were a Black saloon keeper in one of these communities, segregating your saloon could seriously impact your profitability. If you're a white saloon keeper, there's a larger population of white people in the area, and you could actually just segregate and not have Black patrons and still be fine. But for African-American patrons, segregating your saloon could impact your profitability, particularly because the white population was higher. Black liquor dealers protested. In a number of documents that I have, I can see that they're protesting that they are being discriminated against and that they're being targeted by the COF, because African-American saloons are, which they call Black and tans, are the spaces where interracial contact is happening the most. They complain that the strain on their businesses caused by this increased oversight by groups like the Committee of 14, which was not the only one, ultimately was forcing them underground, whether they wanted to be underground or not. And that by being labeled as violators for doing the exact same business that white saloons were doing, it really impacted their businesses and typecast them as criminal in ways that they understood to be completely unfair. They also felt constrained to a large extent, and I have a number of letters from saloon owners who make this very clear, that police officers were extorting graft out of them, whether they were committing crimes or not. Very often, saloons in New York City would pay police to look the other way when they were selling liquor outside of the boundaries, outside of the times that it was legal, or if they had prostitution or gambling, et cetera. Saloons would pay police for the right to continue to run those businesses. But there are African-American saloon owners who make it very clear that whether they were participating in those industries or not, these underground industries, they were extorted. They were sometimes forced to pay up to $75 a month, which was a lot of money in the early 20th century, just to run their saloon. And in one case, one saloon owner named Leroy Wilkins made it very clear that if he did not pay, he realized the police could set him up and put him out of business. They could set him up for a crime and arrest him. So he felt compelled to pay. And if you're paying $75 a month in graft to police, why would you feel compelled to run a legal saloon anyway? So there's a way in which a lot of saloon owners felt forced, compelled, and pushed across the line of legality, whether that's where they wanted to be or not. One saloon owner that I write about significantly in this chapter is William Banks. And I think there's a letter collection by him that I think does a really good job of making it clear what sort of balance a Black saloon owner uniquely needed in order to be able to navigate saloon ownership in New York City at this period. Although racial exclusivity or becoming an all Black saloon could have had its perks, it could be ideal because it would allow you to avoid the wrath of the Committee of 14 or avoid the prying eyes and to feel a little bit safer knowing that you're only serving the African-American community. As I said before, this really caused financial problems, and the owner of the Keystone Cafe, William Banks, makes this very clear in his letter, in one of his letters. In a lot of his early letters, he begs the committee, like all other saloon owners did, to go easy on him, to not close his saloon, to not put him out of business. And he is constantly making promises to make the changes that they're asking him to make. However, we see that his relationship with the committee embitters in 1910, when he really starts to realize how difficult it has been to run his business and how much of his profitability is being affected by their constant intrusions on his business. So he protests their surveillance with this very strongly worded 4-page letter, accentuated by this conspicuously respectable image of himself in the letterhead. And in his message, he reacts to the committee investigations and interference as a form of harassment, and he sarcastically accuses them of racial discrimination. So here's a piece of the letter. He first mounts his defense in the context of economics by saying, quote, "This business, as you know, is one that the patrons themselves make or mar." He's stating very clearly, I don't really have control over what people might do in my saloon. And I also have to be really thoughtful about pleasing my clientele if I even mean to stay in business. Unless I cater to their wishes, I cannot survive. He goes on to say, more importantly, that their intrusions are affecting his ability to do what other men are expected to do and that other men want to do, which is to be self-determining, that they're violating his manhood to a large extent by constantly intruding on his business in ways that they're not doing for everyone else. He says, I don't want to merely exist, I want to live. And if the signing of that agreement is to furnish the former and not the latter, then I decline to live up to it. No man with a particle of manhood binds himself and remains bound when he finds those bonds are detrimental to his best interests, both morally and financially. So Banks, like many other saloon owners, white or black, either allowed or could not stop prostitution, gambling, illegal drugs, and illegal liquor sales from happening, and underground markets flourishing in his saloon. And there are many documents, if we are to hold them to be true, that make it clear that he did have a lot of things going on in his saloon. He's arrested a number of times across the span of the time that his saloon is open. He and others claimed that the harassment and surveillance that they experienced from groups like the Committee of 14 was partly to blame for the fact that they allowed these markets to flourish in their establishments. But they also argued that the high cost of police bribes, as I said before, was pushing them, and that the need to retain customers gave them very little choice but to participate. So what we see with other saloon owners like William Banks and a number of others that I profile in the chapter, we see this group of men, many of which very often wanted and wished to elevate themselves above the ruthless drudgery of that was normally available to African-American men, the kind of work that Sonny Wilkes did. They're looking to create these respectable positions for themselves. And it seems very sincere in a lot of the letters that I read that they wanted to be respectable and that they would be very happy to run saloons without all of these things going on that could threaten their livelihood. They're hoping to gain some measure of respectability through their enterprise. And in their own words, they found themselves criminalized, forced underground, labeled as criminal, and then also unfairly targeted in ways that ultimately threatened their legitimacy. So by looking at spaces like saloons and looking at African-American men like William Banks and Sonny Wilkes, ultimately, my book is an examination of how Black men vindicated legal and illegal responses to oversight, to censure, or to the imperatives of patriarchy. And I make the argument that it's very clear from the sources that manhood occupied their thinking. And I do that using their own words as often as I possibly can. In each chapter, I've analyzed some particular space, whether it's conceptual space or an actual physical space, where Black men were attempting to formalize or forge their masculine identities. First of all, in the first chapter, I look at public spaces where they're facing violence from their neighbors, from their white neighbors, and violence from police, experiencing racial violence that in a lot of ways is working in tandem with racial discrimination and segregation and job discrimination, et cetera. I also, in the chapter that I talked about today, I look at the interracial commercial spaces, spaces of leisure, saloons, and how those places become sites of the construction of Black masculine identity. In the third chapter, I look at the figurative and sometimes figurative, but also physical spaces of interracial sex, and how in one case, I'm looking at an African-American man who is arrested for abducting white women and forcing them into sex slavery. And through the trial, I really questioned what was really happening there and how the term of white slavery was being employed to entrap African-American men. The fourth chapter looks at the domestic space, the politics of Black intimate relationships, and how some men in some cases committed either acts of domestic violence or acts of criminality outside of the home in order to secure some sort of patriarchal control over their households, and where that problematic understanding of masculinity comes from and how it affects their lives and the lives of their wives or partners ultimately. And then the last chapter looks at the carceral state and Black men and also Black women and their imaginations about how to reform themselves as they're leaving prison. And ultimately, I make an argument, well, I make a number of arguments, but one of them is that I see a lot of African-American men who go to prison and get out and are trying to rehabilitate themselves end up kind of benchmarking their understanding of rehabilitation on their relationships with women, and in sometimes impossibly exploitative ways and sometimes otherwise. So ultimately, I theorize that the anti-establishment and illegal behavior that we can discern by Black men in the historical record, it very often signified their refusal to conform to Jim Crow New York. That it signifies their refusal to be completely squelched, to be completely destroyed or cast aside by society, rather than what is very often at the time, and even in our present when we talk about criminality, very often just kind of couched in the individual, personal flaws or deviance that resides in the individual person. That criminality might actually stand in for proclamations of masculine identity, when masculinity in a lot of ways is being denied to someone. And then also that it could serve as an attempt to flip the script of racial or sexual dominance, maybe commandeering some sort of sense of gendered authority, and possibly ultimately just seeking to control one's life in a world that is actually designed in many ways to take that control away. Hence the term uncontrollable Blackness. Lastly, I'd like to say that, as I mentioned before, one of the things that I really like to emphasize, not only in my writing, but also in my teaching, is how important it is to think of history as something that helps us to confront the present and the future, right? They're not just a collection of interesting stories, but that if you can think of history as a way to help us confront what we're dealing with at the moment, but also what is coming at us that we actually we can't see. I think that's the most useful way to understand and employ history. And I use my epilogue to make the connections between these scenes from the early 20th century over 100 years ago, and a lot of our current conversations about race, gender, criminality, police violence, and mass incarceration ultimately. So I'll end by reading a piece from the epilogue that I think is one of the best passages that makes this clear. This is on page 193, and the entire quote is not on here, but what you see on the screen is what I'll end with. I write, with such a deep look at illegality, we can grasp how closely aligned crime and protests very often are. How a protest takes place is often technically criminal or criminalized by others, while crime frequently happens because of the same issues that make people protest. This is one of the foundational theories that to the entire book. As a result, a nuanced understanding of the Black freedom struggle must include Black men who have been driven or seduced onto the other side of the law, very often for reasons that are outside of their control. It is true that people are ultimately accountable for their own choices, but those choices are always made within a societal context that is pivotal when discussing crime. There is a monster in America's past and present, one that swallows Black men whole on the streets, in popular culture, in police custody, and in prisons. This book confronts that beast with an uncomfortable truth. The maze-like crucible of American racism and violence has produced Black criminality. So thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flowe, for a wonderful talk. I know I am just bubbling over with so many questions myself, but I will restrain and start off our question and answer session with a couple of questions of my own to allow all of our attendees to kind of gather their thoughts and put their questions in the chat box. So if you would like to ask Dr. Flowe a question, please put your question in the chat box, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. But to begin, I wanted to start out with the quote that you started your talk with. I actually, for a second, I was like, oh man, Dr. Flowe's kind of stolen my thunder, because that was my first. I was just so taken aback by that quote by Malidoma Some, and and for those who might not have heard it, I'll repeat. You begin your book with an epigraph from Malidoma Some, and Some writes, "There are times when disobedience heals a very ailing part of the self. It relieves the human spirit's distresses at being forced into narrow boundaries. For the nearly powerless, defying authority is often the only power available." And that brings so many historical questions to mind for me, but it also brings even some contemporary questions to mind. So I'll start with the historical. You often speak about Black men's agency and the ways in which they actually utilize illegal activity to assert and establish masculinity, manhood, and to create space and opportunity for themselves. So how do you think this story might look differently outside of New York? I know that, New York is your subject area, so it might be unfair to ask you to to pontificate on, what this would look like somewhere else. But, I guess what I want to get at is, what about New York created opportunities for these men that they might not have experienced elsewhere, particularly in the Deep South?
So to answer the first question, how would this have been different outside of New York? Well, the first thing I would say is it wouldn't be, right? The only thing that's different about the experience that African-American men would have in New York and maybe in Cincinnati or in Jacksonville, Florida at the time is, well, there are a lot of things different, but I would say that the only thing that's different about these factors that produce criminality would be whether you turn the notch up or down, right? In New York, Black men are dealing with a lot of the same factors that Black men are dealing with in Jacksonville or Atlanta at the time. Obviously, there are different geographic spaces. There are different laws, right? There are some laws in Atlanta that don't exist in New York. But ultimately, what they're all dealing with in all different parts of the country is an ecosystem that strangles their opportunities. Part of the reason for the second question, and I think I'm just going to wrap these both up together, part of the reason why a lot of these men moved to New York was because the expectation that their lives would be a lot better in the North. And it's possible, and this was an argument or a part of the study that I didn't really spend a whole lot of time with, but it's possible that there were some ways in which their lives were better, where they did have more opportunities. There were more options. But I was listening to Charles Blow on a podcast today, who just wrote a book about Black power, Black political power. And he was making this argument that over the past 30 or 40 years, a lot of African Americans have been moving back to the South because there are particular ways in which racial discrimination begins to crystallize in the Great Migration period. And by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, there are ways in which African Americans in the North are dealing with more discrimination, more joblessness, more poverty, and more isolation than they are in the South, right? So what's happening is that as Black men and women during this time are moving to the North, doors are closing. Doors that were open, that made it so they wanted to go in the first place, are starting to close because as their populations grow, legislation that is being passed, like the Malby Act that I mentioned before, is just not being actualized. People are shutting church doors and closing off communities and crystallizing a sense of racial hatred that was not nearly as intense at the late 19th century. So just to kind of wrap all of this up, there's, New York is this land of opportunity. It's this land that sparks the imagination, not only of African Americans, but people all over the world who are flocking there to participate in this capitalist rite of passage. But also at the same time, it is closing doors rapidly to African Americans to the point where by the time we get to 1910, 1920, Black people in the North are experiencing large-scale racial violence. They're experiencing police brutality. They're going to prison at higher rates than white people are. So it might look a little bit different, it might feel a little bit different, but ultimately it's what I call a crucible that will push people to make these decisions about how they should interface with the law.
Thank you so much for that. The way I want to apply this, I guess, to our contemporary moment is, I found the part about for the nearly powerless, defying authority is often the only power available. And, so often, particularly in this moment of social justice reform that we're in, it seems as though conversations, mainstream conversations imply that Black protest and disobedience is only acceptable if it's peaceful and if it's civil. And yet, in many ways, it seems as though there is a particular way in which Black communities are held to that standard that other communities are not. And yet, this quote by Some is speaking to the fact that, that it is the most oppressed, it is the most powerless people who, it's like, in many ways, it's like we should be thankful that the most powerless among us are not, burning the house down, And so I in light of that quote and just how powerful it is, how do you see, how do you think about these present day conversations that issue such harsh critiques over the ways in which Black people protest and show their discontent?
Yeah, and there's so much that we could, you and I could have a really long
I know.
conversation about
I know
that.
I know that was a huge question.
Yeah, and I find my mind going in so many different directions. I'm trying to consolidate a little bit. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, and how there were so many people there who did not feel as if they needed to even hide their faces because they were so sure that it was going to be perfectly okay with what they were doing. And putting that aside for a second, I think, I think that is an important part of this conversation, and that there are, there are ways in which what I'm saying with my book, there's ways in which African American men who are selling cocaine on the street in 1905 are protesting, right? They're protesting an economic system that has left them out. They're protesting being left out of an economic system and then being told that you can't do anything outside of this economic system in order to actually achieve what people like to think of as the American dream, right? You're dehumanized because in this country, humans have the capacity to fight for their right to consume or fight for their right to cure their family or to protect themselves, et cetera. And you can't do that, right? And so there's a way in which I am attempting to contextualize that man who's on the street in 1905 selling cocaine as protesting. And ultimately, I'm adding these men to this historiography about the long 20th century civil rights movement. We don't include people who commit crimes and go to prison in the civil rights movement. In the New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander makes this really clear and very important argument that prisoners, I don't remember the exact quote, but she says, prisoners are the only people in America that we all feel perfectly free to hate and discriminate against. So ultimately her work and a lot of work of critical race theorists and also my work is about humanizing people who have been sent to the dustbins, but also trying to understand how they fit into a long historiography of protest. And at the base of this work and also my next work is the idea that we need to understand that protest and criminality ultimately are two sides of the same coin. Not to say that they're always exactly the same, but a lot of the reason why people protest is for the exact same reasons why people commit crimes, and the other way around. A lot of people are committing crimes like selling drugs for the same reasons why people protest. And so putting those two things together and understanding how they work in tandem, how protest is very often, as you're saying, criminalized when it's performed by particular people, then we can understand someone like Sonny Wilkes or someone like Baron Wilkins, one of the saloon owners that I write about, as being a part of this long, pervasive push against this ultimately encirclement that African Americans in general have faced, and in my book, Black men in particular have faced.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I'm going to start. I'm going to start going to questions that have come from our audience. Please forgive me. I'm issuing a public apology up front if I mispronounce anyone's name. This question comes from Derry Goldman. Hopefully I've said that right. And they ask, what similarities do you see between the state-sanctioned violence of Black men today as a result of mass incarceration, inequitable healthcare access, etc., and Black men during Reconstruction at the hands of Jim Crow regulations?
What are the similarities? Well, I mean, this is also a pretty big topic. I teach a class called The Politics of Black Criminality and Popular Protest, where we have an entire semester to consider these things. How many can I fit into this conversation? I mean, I would say that one of the really important things is the way that we think about criminality. In the early 20th century, we see a lot of people, a lot of scientists and politicians, pseudoscientists and writers, scholars who have these ideas about the location of criminality in the individual. particularly when it comes to African Americans, right? I mean, there's, in particular, there's this idea of the atavistic criminal or the born criminal versus the criminal who maybe commits crimes out of circumstance. Well, African Americans and other people of color on the eugenic scale became these atavistic born criminals. And so the location of criminality was in that person. And in the early 20th century, this was a very harmful way of thinking for very obvious reasons, because we can see through my work and through the great work of many others that there were so many constricting aspects that would push people into a circumstance where they might either commit a crime or participate in an underground economy. Well, how is that similar today? Well, I see this continuing. Anyone who's been to New York City or who has lived in New York City before knows that back in 1994 or so, when Rudy Giuliani became the mayor of that city, the first thing he did was bring in William Bratton and consult with the different criminologists who espoused the idea of broken windows. Broken windows policing is ultimately very, very similar to early 20th century understandings of eugenics and criminality, in that it once again relocates the source of criminality in wicked people, right? And if you remove those wicked people, then the community will be fine. And again, completely disregarding any of the structures that surround people, any of the structures that ultimately might compel one or place one on the other side of lines of legality. And to just look at the individual. And again, if you lived in New York City, you know anything about what happened in that city during that time, there were issues of stop and frisk, African Americans and Puerto Rican New Yorkers and other people of color being arrested with impunity and stopped and frisked and treated very badly. He also gave bus tickets to homeless people just to get them out of the way. Again, this is going along with broken windows policing. And that ultimately had some of the exact same effects as what we see in the early 20th century. Black men going to jail or possibly to prison for very petty arrests, instances of violence, like the death of Amadou Diallo that are going to happen if you have police targeting a particular racial group in a city, so on and so forth. So I think ideologically, to kind of like draw that all of the different spokes of that question into one answer, ideologically, we're thinking in some of the same ways. We have some of the same racial and criminological logic that will ultimately bring about some of the same results of violence, of over-policing, of over-surveilling, of mass incarceration. Obviously, in the early 20th century, there was no mass incarceration. There were far fewer bodies in prison than there are now. But again, we can see the seeds of what ends up becoming legislation and more bodies in prison by the time we get to the 1960s and further on. We can see that in the early 20th century. I'll try to be a little bit shorter with my answers so we can have more questions.
No, you're fine. This question comes from Aisha Heichel, who's actually one of our archivists at the Avery African American Research Center. And so her question, rightfully so, is on the archive. And so she wants you to elaborate on the historical record and your perspective on the new collecting being done by UCLA on police and mass incarceration.
Well, so to talk about the historical record, I'll say, well, I'm not exactly sure where to go with this, but I'll choose this particular path to answer the question. This project is obviously very, very heavily anchored in primary sources. When I first approached it, I was thinking, how am I going to actually be able to, achieve this goal of getting the voices of African-American men? These were not people who were carrying around diaries and didn't have these large paper collections like maybe Du Bois or Booker T. Washington might have. So how do I get their perspectives? And so I went into this determined to find those perspectives. And there's a lot of sources I could talk about. I'll focus on a couple. There's obviously an issue of their voices being heard in particular formats. in a trial transcript, right? I mean, if you're in a courtroom, you're not going to give your unvarnished thoughts and opinions about what you're experiencing. You have this rhetorical goal every time you speak. The closest I was able to find to their unvarnished thoughts was the prison archives. There's a really large and wonderful collection of prison documents at the New York State Archives. There's a number of men's prisons and a lot of African-American men, unfortunately / fortunately, I had their files. And they were good, but they did not give me their voices in the way that I was looking for. The last couple of times I went to the archives, I did something new. One of the times I was there, I said, you know what, let me just stop looking at men's files. I'm gonna look at some of the women's files. And I had already looked at some of the women's files in the past because I definitely do write about women in this project, but I just gave myself a whole week to kind of dig deeply into the women's files. And what I ended up finding serendipitously was that the men's voices came through even more clearly in the women's files than they did in the men's files. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, women are connected to men through marriage and through parenthood. In some cases, they have letters from their fathers, etc. So there's naturally going to be some content involving men in these archives. But what I didn't anticipate was that because Black women, particularly in places like Bedford Hills Reformatory, Black women, but also white women, because when they left prison and while they were there was this imperative to reform them, to turn them into some model of true womanhood, right? Which was not happening for the men. For men, the idea was to make it so that they could perform some sort of function of work and just send them out there and get them working and making money. But for women, there was this rush to try and change them, to reform them in so many different ways. And as a result, that included reading their personal letters, forcing them to write long letters once they left on parole, digging into their lives in these very intrusive ways that was obviously unfortunate for them, but fortunate for me. I was able to see a more complete view of their lives and therefore the men in their lives than I was able to see when I looked at the men's files, which were very sparse in contrast. So just to say that, to answer the question about the archives, I think it was very interesting for me to kind of dig through and find these voices, and ultimately I hit this mother lode that helped me to really draw out some of the deeper thoughts, the less surveilled thoughts of the men in my study. I have to say about the UCLA archive, I'm not very familiar with it enough to be able to make much of a comment on it. If it is what it sounds like, that it's an archive of police violence, I mean, obviously I think that would be, that's very wonderful. But I unfortunately don't know enough about it to be able to make a specific comment on it.
Okay, thank you so much. Your discussion of women is a really great segue into this next question that comes from Jason Coy. And they say, I found Dr. Flowe's treatment of agency to be compelling, especially his notion that it is always bounded by circumstances. Did African-American women face similar conditions driving them into criminality? I know that it is outside the scope of his study, but I'd be interested in hearing his thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. So in order to grapple with this, right, I really did not want to write a book that just gave a bunch of stories and we could look at them and say, this is interesting, and then move on. I wanted to create some sort of teeth that would make it so that everything I'm saying, everything that is revealed in the book ends up having the ability to be applied elsewhere, right? So geographically, temporally, but also in terms of gender. So the crucible of Black criminality was a theoretical model that I came up with, which says that a history of enslavement and a history of racial violence creates this crucible that African-American men, in this case, but also women, are responding to. That there's a history of Black men in particular being denied the normative vestiges of masculinity, that there is this penchant in American society to constantly find these ways to contain sources of mainstream anxiety. And I see this as being applicable to women also, that also economic threats that I didn't mention just now. But I see this being applicable to women in a lot of ways. First of all, women are dealing with the same economic threats and the violence and the history of enslavement. They're not dealing with the exact same issues as it revolves around manhood, but they're dealing with their own issues as it revolves around womanhood. Actually, one of the points I make is that Black men, in some cases, and I make that clear in some of my chapters, actually compose a part of that crucible for Black women. So this is a model that can be applied to men and women, and it's meant to really contextualize and make sense of the actions that someone like Sonny Wilkes might take, or any of the other men and women in the book. They're surrounded by this, what I call a crucible, which is really just like a 1,001 obstacles that force them to constantly reassess their relationship with the law, which in a lot of ways is meant to uphold that very same crucible.
Thank you. All right, our next question is from Amy Gordonier, and she says, I'd love to ask about the way in which Dr. Flowe so carefully frames the way he needs to navigate around his subjects' agency and quote unquote criminality, because it's strikingly different in some ways and overlaps in others with the way historians in my own field have approached records of crime and punishment that we use to try to get at the experiences of marginalized people.
Yeah, so this was something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. Sorry, I wish I could turn the light up in here, but I don't have any other way to do that. It's, you know, how did I, originally I asked myself, how do I want to talk about crime? Well, first of all, I had to define what crime is. I make pretty clear in my teaching and also in my in the book that we have to understand that criminality is not a fixed thing, right? There are certain things that we might all say, you shouldn't do that, right? There are many of them. But there also are a lot of things that are defined as criminality by those who have the power to make that determination. So that's one really important thing. But then secondly, I wanted to say, you know, as I don't want to take the agency from these men as historical actors. I don't want to write a history that says they're being tossed around back and forth and blown in the winds of the society that they're in, and that they don't have any agency. So there's this really fine line between saying these men are being affected by the society that they're in. Their decision-making processes are being skewed to some extent. They're being circumscribed in ways that might make it more likely that they would need to resist by breaking the law. But then at the same time, they're human beings, they're people, they're making decisions. And that, again, I make that statement at the beginning that I'm not condemning or romanticizing, because I need that to be understood from the beginning. But I do want to, you know, understand how they're making their own decisions. There's a part of the third section of the chapter that I talked about today on saloons, where I write about this man named Wesley Maxwell, who was known as a bully. Spoiler alert: he's killed by someone at this saloon that he spends a lot of time in. And the question I'm asking is, why was he a bully? Why was he beating people up and taking their money? What was there for him to gain by creating this persona for himself that was like, you know, a gangster or tough? He was terrorizing people in his own community. And I make it pretty clear, you know, that there's a way in which we have to understand, you know, Francis Fanon talks about this in The Wretched of the Earth, that we have to understand that horizontal violence comes from violence, that when there's this violent society where people are placed into circumstances where they compete for resources and compete for power, that could be the result. Not to say that it is always the result, and not to, again, to excuse that, but just to understand it. And I think the only way to truthfully understand it is to recognize the agency while also recognizing the structure surrounding the person when they make their own decisions.
Thank you. We actually had a couple of people have questions about Frantz Fanon. And so from Irina Gigava, as well as Deborah Frisbee, I'm trying to combine these two questions, but they say that they are curious if you use, and if so, how, Frantz Fanon's theories on Black masculinity, as well as his analysis of the oppressed. How do you use that in connection with your own work?
Yeah, I mean, so actually, I use it in the way that I just mentioned in order to contextualize horizontal violence, as I mentioned before. I won't pretend to be an expert on Fanon, and that it was definitely helpful in contextualizing something that I was really one of the ways that I wanted to think about New York and wanted to think about Jim Crow is as if it ultimately can be understood as a colonized society. The African Americans are leaving the South and moving to the North, and in a lot of ways they end up becoming a part of this seemingly colonized underclass. And Fanon's work was really important in thinking about how to say that even though this is not a colony in the same way that we would think of as in North Africa, which is what Fanon writes mostly about, that we can still kind of understand this group of people as being detached from the mainstream society, not because of their own inclinations, in some of the same ways that we would see in a colonization situation. I mean, I'm definitely a fan of Fanon's work. For this work, I didn't use it as deeply to contextualize much more than the two ways that I just mentioned.
Thank you. I want to, we're getting close to time. So I want to at least just acknowledge this question, even though I think that in a way you've already answered it, but I think it's good to just, to bring it to the forefront. And this is from Lisa Covert, and she says that I was struck by the opening anecdote about Sonny Wilkes and that he came from Honduras. It made me wonder to what extent this is also a story about the Black Caribbean. And I'm thinking about the recent book by, and I'm going to massacre this name, Jesse Hoffnung Garskoff, entitled Racial Migration, which is about Afro-Latinx New York during the same time period. But I think, I wanted to just kind of give space to some of the different places. You said that your book in many ways can be a blueprint. And I just wanted to kind of give speak to an arena in which it can be applied, and thinking not only about Black women, but also the Black diaspora as a whole. So I'm going to end with a question by my gracious co-chair, Elisa Jones. And her question is, how can your research, which exposes the inherent connections between illegality in Jim Crow New York and protests against racial injustice, help us better understand the way that Black voices in public spaces and even the potential for peaceful protests against racial inequality are policed and criminalized today? Are there lessons here that we can learn from or that could influence potential reforms?
Yeah, well, so the first project here is, as I mentioned before, the humanization of people who have been labeled criminal, right? Which is a very, very instrumental aspect of dealing with what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, right? And when she's calling mass incarceration the new Jim Crow, she's essentially saying that we've had these cascading racial caste systems, right? So if we were to understand and agree upon the idea that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow or the new racial caste system, then it's at the foundation of some of the systems that we need to break apart. So this work is looking at African American men who are outside of prison, and then ultimately at the end is talking about men who are in prison. So we're looking at the lives that people might live before they go to prison, and what sorts of factors, what sorts of human notions or human fears or human difficulties they might face or might be forced to face that might lead them to commit crimes, right? So first, we're humanizing people who end up going to jail. Then secondly, with the ending of the book and then also with my second book, I plan to talk about the experience of imprisonment, which I think ultimately will do a couple of things. One, it will make clear the humanization of people who are in prison, but also the life ways of survival and resistance that people in prison, especially African Americans, have enacted throughout the 20th century. It's also meant to draw our understanding of mass incarceration deeper into the past. As I said before, we often think about mass incarceration as this thing that spontaneously happened in the 1960s, and that really starts to ramp up with the Anti-Narcotic Act of 1986. But the seeds of those things, the ideologies, the ways of thinking, the cultural and social components that support it begin in the late 19th century. There's this really, I'm sorry to keep referencing the new Jim Crow, but I think it's a very important book when we're talking about these things. It's also very accessible. There's a way in which she kind of explains that Jim Crow itself in the early 20th century was not only supported by law, but it was supported by this entire cultural structure that everyone participated in, right? I mean, we see the spectacle of lynching, which was people on the street, individuals, children that were let out of school to come and watch. We also see cultural forms like minstrelsy and coon songs that were meant to reinforce the cultural and popular imagination logic that African Americans needed to be controlled inside of this structure. So ultimately, I see my work as a part of breaking down the logic of mass incarceration, breaking down the logic of the current cultural racial caste system that without breaking down, we really can't begin to move forward. There are people that are ensnared by it. There are people who are on their way to it. There are people who are ensnared in some of the ways that we are thinking outside of prison. This, what Michel Foucault would have called carceral archipelagos that exist outside of prison, that bring the ideologies, the imperatives, the ways of thinking of the carceral state into public and private space that are funneling people into those spaces. So I really see, and then let's, not to even talk about all of the rippling effects of imprisonment on Black communities. So I see my work as looking to break down all of those systems through critical criminological theory and critical race theory, break those ideas down for that purpose of dismantling the logic of mass incarceration.
Thank you so much for engaging us with, and I also want to thank our participants as well for asking such thoughtful questions, and to thank you, Professor Flowe, for providing us with such wonderful answers. I think like any good lecture, any good talk, and any good Q&A, you're left with even more questions than you started out with. And, and I think that's the beauty of the work that we do, is that there's just still so much to be done. And so thank you for shining light and giving us new conversations to have in our classrooms and with our colleagues and within our communities as well.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation. And also thank you for all of those great provoking questions. These are things that I love to be provoked because I'm working on a new book and I need to bring some of those questions into the new project. So this is always really helpful and fruitful for me too. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Flowe and Dr. Eves for such a wonderful conversation, and all of our guests. And we would like to invite the chair of the Department of History here at the College of Charleston, Dr. Jason Coy, to close us out with a few words.
Well, Dr. Flowe, thank you so much for that wonderful talk on the behalf of the History Department at the College of Charleston. I just want to thank you. It was certainly a very fitting way to begin our inaugural Black History Month lecture series. On the one hand, it was so timely, and I think that's something that came through in the talk time and again, but also I think it's a great model of the way that the history of crime and the history of the way that crime is constructed. I really think it provides a model for our students of the ways that can really shed a lot of light on the past, but also it can kind of reveal a lot of troubling truths about the present day. And I think, I'm an historian of crime myself, so I'll be rushing out to buy your book right away. A lot of what you were talking about, it really echoes things, you brought up Foucault, it echoes the sorts of things that historians of crime see in all sorts of societies when you're dealing with this kind of oppression. And so I just want to thank you. I really love the way these Zoom talks have allowed us to bring people in from all over the country and share their ideas and discuss their ideas. The sad part is you get robbed of the thundering applause that you so richly deserve this way because everyone's on mute. But I do hope maybe when your next book comes out, we can invite you back to the College of Charleston for a real visit, and we can wine and dine you and get to know you better and give you those applause. So thank you very much. And thanks a lot to the audience for all the great questions and for your attentiveness. All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you all so much.